one of the final international speakers, Mike Hearn. He is one of the Bitcoin developers. He worked actually at Google for quite some time, a couple of years. And then he was working on Bitcoin and became so busy with that he went full time on that. And while he's setting up, actually after this speaker we will have the break. Just so you know.
Well, I've been looking very much forward to Mike's speech because he's actually with his hand on the code. Because I mean, you have about 10 people worldwide who decide, what's in the code and who basically come up with new features. It's only 10 people, and then there's 150,000 miners who have to accept it, the changes. But whatever these guys come up with happens in the future. So it's really, I'm convinced we're now doing 65,000 Bitcoins payments a day, or between 50 and 100,000. And that's nothing, because we're doing 200 billion payments internationally a year. So, Bitcoin is teeny little. So I'm really interested, when are we going to do millions and tens of millions?
That's interesting, actually, because that's exactly what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah, that's why I'm so interested in your speech.
Okay, thank you very much.
Take it away.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction. Just so I know who I'm talking to, can you put your hands up if you work at a bank or financial institution of some kind? Yeah, if you work in software business of some kind? How many of you know C++? Oh, loads. Okay, well, I'm afraid this talk is not really technical at all, so if you guys were expecting that, sorry. But I'll be giving a talk and I'll be doing a demo of some new app I've been writing on Saturday. So if you are at the conference in the next couple of days, come along there and come and have a look, and I'll show you some cool stuff. But we're not going to do tech stuff today. Let me just start that. Great. So I want to talk a little bit about growth trends and things like that. But just to start with, I want to, just for a moment, to reflect on how far we've come. You've heard loads of, Bitcoin's amazing and all that stuff. And let's just reflect, just for one slide, just indulge me for 1 second, about where we've come from. Because, we started in January 2009 with the very first release of Bitcoin ever. At this point, it had no users, and there was no exchange rate, and that's because there was nothing to buy, and no one was selling anything. Probably in the history of humanity, there has never been a money more useless than Bitcoin at this point, because every other money, even like cowrie shells on a beach, was invented to make some trade happen. But Bitcoin wasn't. It was just created because. And there was no discussion forum, so there was no community. And the software, just to top it off, it had critical security bugs that no one knew about at this point, so it didn't even work. So we came from literally nothing, one man in the whole world knowing what Bitcoin was, to the man on the street knowing what Bitcoin was. And that's amazing, so, here's Bitcoin on the moon, to use one of the more ridiculous sort of memes that goes around on the internet. No matter, even if you think Bitcoin is a load of bollocks and it's all hype, which is a perfectly valid opinion to have, you got to admit that is a pretty amazing story. And it says a lot about how fast ideas can spread in our society. Now, the work so far was tough, it was risky, and it was dangerous. It's easy to forget that, some years ago, those of you who work at banks, right, you know all about the amazing laws that governments have passed where they're very vague, and the penalties are very harsh. So the people who started working on these projects, going to jail was a real fear. Luckily, that mostly has not happened. China is sort of banning it, in the process of banning it now, and sort of Russia a little bit too, but in the West, things have been kind of working out okay, despite all the challenges. So this is what I want to talk about today. I want to reflect a little bit on what does it mean to be successful. Right? I'm thinking about that a lot now. I've quit Google, which was a very successful company, and I'm working on this crazy project. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing. It's really tempting to define success as all or nothing. I think you've heard some of this today. Even Satoshi said, at some point he said, Bitcoin will either be worth nothing in 10 years or it'll be worth everything, a huge amount. And you see this kind of thinking. People compare Bitcoin to the internet and things like that. But I'm not really convinced that this is the right way to think about it. And for me, from my personal perspective, I've put in many, many hours and late nights and long weekends into Bitcoin since I first started working on it in 2010. And if it ends up solving some people's problems some of the time, then that's okay. I don't perceive a time when Bitcoin will really take over the world. Email, a very successful, undoubtedly very successful system. It's been around 20 years now, and only new companies run paperless offices. Right? Google runs a paperless office, but most companies never got that far. It didn't kill the post. It didn't kill lots of things. So Bitcoin is going to be living alongside all these other systems for a very long time. And I worry that we don't really manage expectations properly in our community. We've got a kind of, I don't want to call it a VC bubble, because some of these companies have genuinely strong businesses, but especially there's been a rash of what you might call Bitcoin 2.0 projects lately, which have received large sums of money, and a lot of them, there isn't really a whole lot to them, I feel. Some of them are kind of sketchy. And I don't see anyone really talking about the most likely endgame scenarios for Bitcoin because of this belief that it's going to be to the moon or to nothing. And because it's not nothing, therefore it must be taking over the world, right? And yet I find the most plausible outcome actually is sort of Bitcoin ends up with niche appeal, but maybe it doesn't even really go mainstream and become really big. So I want to talk a little bit about how this can happen, right? Is this just a theoretical concern or is it real? How do we get stuck in a niche from which we can't get out? The most common way I've seen projects get stuck in a niche, and I've seen this happen multiple times in different contexts, is ultimately they start ignoring what people want. It sounds incredibly basic, right? But they ignore what people want. Why? Oh, they never think they're ignoring what people want. They tell themselves that they're not, but they are. And this can happen because, for example, their incomes stop depending on the success of their product. I saw this quite a lot at Google, actually, where you're going to get a salary even if your product doesn't really take off. So people can get very lazy and they're not hungry. So they end up not correcting bad decisions. And in Bitcoin, a very easy way this could happen is if the community sort of collectively decides that we prefer ideological purity to adoption. There are a number of scenarios and cases and events coming up, some of them have already come up, where we face a choice where people can either choose between their ideological beliefs or what would be suitable for mass market adoption. And it's not clear which way Bitcoin will go, I must say. It could go either way. It's easy to just say, oh, Bitcoin works great, but in fact it's got all kinds of deep technical issues we still have to fix, and failure to fix any one of them could lead to us just being uncompetitive versus banking. And what this looks like is sort of huge, fast growth and lots of excitement and investment and millions of conferences. Oh my God, so many conferences, until we saturate our niche. And at that point, what we will see is usage plateau, and if interest would eventually fade. Right? The excitement and the investment goes away, and the stuff that we've built is still there and it's still being used, but it's not really growing. Good example of that, and people hate me when I bring this example up sometimes, desktop Linux circa 2000. This was the project to take Linux, which is today primarily used on the server, and make it compete with Windows. Tons of investment, tons of startups, lots of conferences, lots of excitement. Microsoft genuinely worried, was this the next big thing that was going to topple them from their throne? No, right? We know the answer now. We have 10 years of hindsight. It didn't really go anywhere. It saturated its niche of people for whom software was a lifestyle choice. We have a user, I think. Do you use desktop Linux? Well, it's not actually the same set of software at all. If you're running a tablet, that's actually a completely different set of tools that were built back then. People talked about desktop Linux in the same way they talk about Bitcoin today. So this is not a hypothetical concern, right? Failure is an option. Now, if we take it this far and we say, well, it's possible for Bitcoin to get stuck in a niche, then the obvious logical next question is, are we already there? Now, I hope Tony doesn't hate me for this. This is a quote from BitPay's announcement of this $30 million investment just recently. They said, Last May, we had maybe 4,000 merchants, and today we have over 40,000, so we're 10 times bigger from an overall customer perspective. When you look at transactions, we're doing 10 times more transactions. And you're like, wow, that's amazing, right? 10 times growth in 1 year. What business would not kill for 10x growth in 1 year? That's amazing. But we can read this quote another way, which is that BitPay's volume is only scaling as they add more merchants, right? If both merchant base and consumer base and user base of Bitcoin were both growing simultaneously, we would expect to see more than 10x transaction growth. Bitcoin is a pretty transparent system, so we can actually plot a graph of transaction traffic. This is data from around 1 year ago to today in terms of transactions per day. So you can see we started around 25,000 per day a year ago. And then it sort of grows slowly throughout the summer, that sort of organic growth, because not much is going on. It goes crazy at the end of November. What happened here is the Silk Road was taken down, and then there was a positive Senate hearing a week or two later, and suddenly, the floodgates opened for institutional investment. And also China got involved at this point. They're now getting uninvolved again, of course. So the price went crazy, then it came down, and it left, all these events left traffic about 3 times higher, 2.5 to 3 times higher than it was before. So that was a permanent increase in usage. I love data. This is a habit I picked up at Google. So let's look at more data. Bitcoin Wallet for Android is the most popular Bitcoin smartphone wallet in the world by orders of magnitude. It's a lot more popular than the next runner-up. Full disclosure, I helped build it. It's one of the apps I work on. I'm so proud of this. So here's a graph of total installs over time. This is from Andreas Schildbach, who writes it, but it's based on code I've written. There's a glitch here because I had to edit the graph to chop out a lot of time, but we can see here that around February 17th, we've got very few users. We've got about 50,000, maybe 75,000 at this point. There are a few events on this graph that are worth looking at. This one here, this little uptick in usage here, this is not reflective of anything that happened with Bitcoin. What happened here is we made the app a lot faster, actually, believe it or not. So people used it a lot more. And then, we see this organic growth throughout the summer. So Bitcoin's growing, people are telling their friends about it, it keeps growing. Then, we have this huge run-up in price. Silk Road is gone, US government is looking more friendly. The slope of new installs at this point is permanently better than it was in the summer, right? So we're adding new users faster than ever before. So you look at this graph and you're like, wow, brilliant, we're doing pretty well. But are we really? Let's look at more data. And I must say at this point, thanks to Andreas for giving me this data, because most wallet providers won't show you this graph that I'm about to show you. This is total active installs. I don't know if you can see that at the back. You might want to stand up or look at the screens. So you can see it looks much the same. We've got slow growth throughout the summer. This is a graph minus uninstalls, basically. And then a huge growth around November. We actually went from around 50,000, slightly more than 50,000 active users up to 150,000 by the end of the year. Tripled growth again. But then look what happens, right? At the end of February, Bitcoin stops growing. And I argue this app is a very good proxy for Bitcoin usage overall, because the top graph that you see there, it matches very well with blockchain.info and other wallet providers that have been released, right? It correlates very well with other data that we have. So this bottom graph, what this shows is that at this point, we're losing users as fast as we're adding them. And there's not, by the way, there's nothing that would, there's no change we made to the app at this point that would explain that. So what happened? So yeah, there's no new competitors or technical issues that could explain this. There is a very simple explanation, however. So Bitcoin growth is driven by press cycles. Yeah, no surprise there. People find out about it. They install it. They get involved. Prices go up. It's sort of a feedback loop. And then what happened at the end of February? Yeah, Mt. Gox happened. Right, that's what happened. People heard about Mt. Gox in the newspaper. They saw a lot of people think, oh, Bitcoin has gone bankrupt, because they don't really understand what it's about. A lot of people lost money, presumably. I didn't, but a lot of people did, I think. And, people sort of lose interest. So at this point, and prices are falling as well, so there's less incentive to get involved. People churn their phones every 2 years on average, so we would expect a natural sort of 4% loss rate if people stopped caring, because that's, people wouldn't uninstall the app and reinstall it. Obviously, the real loss rate is less, because some users obviously do care, right? Maybe, this is going to take 6 to 12 months for us to really recover like actual adding users at a significant rate again. Maybe. We don't know. Of course, unless another exchange or big hot wallet goes pop. There are still lots of Bitcoin users in the world who, they're not actually Bitcoin users, are they? They actually deposit their Bitcoins with a third party, and what they get in return are promises that they'll get it back. That's not really what Satoshi intended when he built a system that wasn't supposed to have any middlemen. Right, but that's how a lot of people are using it. Is this necessarily a problem? Well, if we go back to just the last graph and think about that completely flat line at the end. Actually, I've seen this kind of graph before. When I worked on Google Maps, one graph I saw one day was a graph of total usage from the start of the product. Now, I'm sure we all have Google Maps in our pocket. We use it all the time. It's a fantastically successful product. But actually, after it first became available, there was a big spike in usage, and then a lot of that usage went away, right? Because people tried it out, and then they sort of like stopped caring. And for a long time, its traffic was completely flat. Actually, it wasn't growing at all. And eventually, they tried all kinds of things. We added features and we did all kinds of things. But eventually, we did find one change which made that graph go from being flat to growing again. And it kept growing, and it's been growing ever since, actually. Does anyone want to take a guess what change we made to Google Maps that broke us out of this? Street View? No. Navigation? No.
Pre-installed.
Sorry? Actually, all this took place before the smartphone revolution. This is like 2004, 2005 time. No, traffic environment? No, give up. You'll never guess. I'm just messing with you. You had zero chance of guessing this. I would never have guessed this until I was told, and I worked there on the product. I worked for Google Maps for 3 years. What we did is we made it load faster. Yeah. Remember that little bump at the start of the graph I showed you for the Bitcoin wallet for Android, where we made it a lot faster, and that permanently increased usage? It's the same for maps. You would never guess these things, would you? People are weird. So what's really happening here? Right? So what's actually happening, this is the core story of Bitcoin at the moment. Merchant adoption is outstripping user adoption very fast. Right? We're adding merchants far faster than we're adding users, and that makes a ton of sense because Bitcoin is great for sellers and is less great for buyers. Right? If you sell with Bitcoin, you don't have to deal with fraud. You don't have to deal with legitimate chargebacks because we still have not built the dispute mediation mechanism that Satoshi designed back in many years ago. You don't really have any transaction fees and so on. In fact, when someone sends Bitcoins to you, they pay the transaction fee. There is a very tiny fee. It's like a fraction of a cent, but it's actually paid for by the sender. And as a result, the elevator pitch to get people using Bitcoins either tends to be ideological, right? We heard this at the start of the day, or it's about trades banks won't allow, but this is kind of like a waste of time. And in the past, it's also been about getting rich quick, but prices are falling right now, so that doesn't work either. So, and then there's a low inflation argument, and this is a genuinely legitimate argument, but actually right now, Bitcoin's inflation is really high, right? We say like Bitcoin has low inflation, and it will, because there's a formula that decides how much inflation will take place, and that may well be very appealing to people in places like Argentina 10 years from now, but it's not relevant at the moment. Bitcoin's inflation at the moment is kind of like average across all world countries. So what happens is a man on the street hears this pitch and he thinks, this sounds like a solution looking for a problem. I don't think this solves any problem I have, so I'm not going to use it. And they use credit cards, which mostly win today because you kind of get one by default unless you live in a high fraud region of the world or you don't have access to banking or you're a poor credit risk. And there's lots of people who can't get one of these, but for people who are technically inclined and have spare money to risk on crazy technical projects, that's basically people in the West, right? So we all have credit cards. There's no malware risk. I mean, there's huge malware risk. People get screwed all the time by viruses and credit cards, but it's always a seller that gets screwed, right? Another reason why people like Bitcoin if they're selling things. The experience of using credit cards online is appalling. It was designed by someone who hates people. I can only imagine that, you've got to type in a number, and then sometimes it accepts spaces, and sometimes it doesn't, and then there's other numbers that you have to pick from a list, and then there's more numbers that only have sometimes, and then maybe you get asked for a password, or maybe you don't, and it's impossible to predict, and then, they forget it all next time, because that would be insecure. And basically, you could just type in, like, a password, and it would have worked just fine, but, the whole thing it's just atrocious. I hate it. But when you actually have the card with you, then it's actually not that bad. And especially, the new NFC payment stuff that they're doing, when it works, it's actually pretty good. It often fails. But if we ignore that, it actually is pretty good when it works. And of course, the killer feature of credit cards, you can spend money you didn't earn yet, right? How is Bitcoin going to compete with that? You can't. So, Bitcoin transactions are cheaper, and that's often what people say. Oh, this is like the killer feature that Bitcoin has, right? Really cheap transactions. But this overlooks the fact that today, a lot of the infrastructure is built by volunteers working in their evenings and weekends. Right? Volunteers like me, please feel sorry for me. All that work I did for cheap transactions. This is not sustainable, right? You can't have a large, world-spanning financial infrastructure which is held together by chewing gum and sticky tape and people who kind of work on it when they have time because they feel like it. It's going to have to change, and at some point, people are going to have to start paying for their wallets one way or another, and dispute mediation and risk analysis services and all these other things, and then that will increase our costs as well. And whether we actually work out being cheaper than credit cards or not is, I think, an open question at this point. We will definitely be cheaper for some kinds of transactions because with Bitcoin, you can kind of assemble the features you need. Like not every transaction has to be reversible, and not every transaction, has to be reversible and covered by this malware risk and all this stuff. Sometimes you want to make a very small payment, and it's okay if you do it from an insecure device, right? It's fine. But for the sort of buying pizza online and stuff, this is the issue that we face. And the funny thing is, Satoshi knew this right from the start. This is a quote from his white paper. It says, I'm sure you can read it, but I'll read it to you anyway. Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process payments. This is the opening of his paper. Whilst the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weaknesses of the trust-based model. And then he goes on to list things like, lots of fraud and can't do micropayments and the problems we're all familiar with credit cards. But, he starts out by admitting people can buy things online, right? There is a system and it kind of works, even though it's sort of not that great. So we need to think about, how can we break ourselves out of this sort of slow period where we're not really growing? How can we grow faster? How do we play to our strengths instead of just sort of trying to chase the credit card companies for transactions where they already sort of win by default? So we can focus on small payments. Tipping is something you don't ever really do with credit cards. I've heard that in Finland, there are street performers who do actually have chip and pin machines with them, and you can chip them. You can tip them with your card. I just can't imagine how that works. It would take you like 30 seconds to tip someone. That's just not as cool as throwing some money in a hat, right? That would be anti-cool. But actually, people tip each other with Bitcoin all the time, and some very innovative tipping platforms have been made on the internet for hey, that was a cool post on Reddit, have 10 cents or something, It can be kind of insulting. And then if you go even lower than tipping, you've got micropayments. Bill splitting. Are there any people from Denmark in the house? No, okay. So I read last week that there's this thing called mobile pay, and I guess it's a mobile app, I don't really know. But apparently it's got 25% adoption in Denmark in 1 year. And all it does is it lets you split bills at restaurants really conveniently. And I've actually done this with Bitcoin, because it is actually pretty convenient to split bill with Bitcoin. One guy pays, and then everyone's just tap their phone and press send, and it's done, right? And it's actually pretty convenient. So we could exploit that. Even though we haven't built any features to make it easy, it's still pretty good compared to cards or cash. There are, of course, lots of sellers that banks refuse to serve, even though they are legal. This isn't so much a problem in Europe, I think, but in America, what you've started to see is, for example, in Colorado, they took a vote and they legalized marijuana, but it's still illegal at the federal level. So none of these shops can actually accept card transactions. It's all based on cash, which is unbelievably dangerous for the people running these shops, right? Because everyone knows there are these shopkeepers running around with massive bags of cash in their car. And this is stupid, right? I mean, the people of Colorado and Washington, they made the decision they're going to allow this, and the banks just aren't playing ball. And I don't blame the banks because, they're in this horrible environment where Washington is always squeezing their balls to make them do what they want, right? It's like they've been turned into a tool of American policy. So that's one sort of niche we can sort of serve and grow. Bitcoin transactions today, they are cheap, right? Even though I said maybe that's going to change, maybe it won't, right? Who knows? We can't really predict the future. And today they are cheaper. And maybe if people could see how much money they were saving versus credit cards, and like wallet apps could just add it up for you and show you at the end of the month and say, hey, you saved 20 euros this month just by using Bitcoin. People are very sensitive to saving money. And this is a very simple feature we can add. This is like 1 or 2 engineer months maybe to get everyone on board and implement the code. Then maybe that can be a really good way we can grow faster. And then actually, one of the most frequent places I use Bitcoin, believe it or not, is like cafes and bars and stuff, where they're usually cash only. They won't accept cards at all, I guess because it's too expensive. But they accept Bitcoin. And the reason is, you only need paper, believe it or not. This kind of blew my mind. But when you think about it, it makes sense, because the alternative is they have kind of a dedicated tablet or smartphone just for accepting payments in their cafe. And they, often they have a lot of staff turnover with waiters and waitresses and stuff, so they would need a shared device, and that's kind of expensive. And, everyone would need to be trained, and it's just a hassle. But what they actually do is they print out a Bitcoin address on a QR code on a bit of paper and sticky tape it to the back of their shop. And then if you want to pay with Bitcoin, they just point at it and they say, there you go, you know what to do. This is unbelievably insecure, but very cheap and convenient. So I've been thinking about, one of the things I've been researching lately is I'm like, well, maybe we can actually make this work better. So maybe instead of just maybe you have a QR code sticky to your cafe, but then you also have this piece of paper that you've printed out, or someone's printed out for you, and it's got several columns of random words. And then what happens is we're adding a feature to Bitcoin where you can have messages that go back and forth with payments. I know it sounds stupid, but this is a feature that Bitcoin did not have at the start. And so, a company like BitPay, for example, or any provider of this service, it's just software, it's not very complicated, can just have this list of words, and then every time someone pays, on the screen of their phone, the next random word shows up, and then you show it to the waitress, and they cross it off the list. And this solves a problem that the current paper point of sale has, which is that they just sort of, you pay, and then you show them your screen, and they just sort of trust that what's on the screen actually is a wallet, and it's not like a fake payment. But they have no idea if they really received money, because all they've got is paper. So, this is something that like a student can implement in, 1 week. This is so easy. And yet it could really make adoption at small merchants much easier. And then there's the more sci-fi stuff that I've covered in talks I've given in previous years, so I didn't want to just repeat that. Bitcoin separates out dispute mediation from the process of making the payment, which is something banks and credit cards don't do. So banks and credit card companies, they do have dispute mediation, but it's a one-size-fits-all. And often they get it wrong, or they kind of suck at it. But with Bitcoin, you can have specialized mediators. Kickstarter on your desktop, so this is crowdfunding. I'm going to talk more about that on Saturday if anyone wants to come along and you're going to that conference as well. Last summer, me and Matt, actually I got an intern at Google, Matt, who's another Bitcoin developer, and we worked on micropayments together, so we implemented a prototype of, a bunch of things. But things like where you pay per second for internet radio, or you pay per kilobyte for Wi-Fi. So the idea there is that, for example, in the Wi-Fi case, you can just walk into a room, and then your phone will start paying for high-quality bandwidth, but it doesn't have to ask you any questions. It's like when you roam across cell towers on a train as you go across the countryside. Your phone isn't constantly saying, do you trust this tower? Do you trust this tower? Do you trust this tower? No, because it's stupid, right? And micropayments allow you to have this for like other things too, because if the hotspot you're talking to turns out to be malicious or broken, you only lose like 1/10 of a cent or whatever. It doesn't matter. You can create anonymous private digital identities with Bitcoin, it turns out. So this is perhaps a solution to spam on the internet and things. Come and ask me afterwards if you're interested in that. And then this is the talk on the program. There's a video of a talk that I gave last year. So if you want to learn more about this, watch that. This is where machines own themselves. So you have like a self-driving car, which actually doesn't have any company or human that owns it. It like hires humans when it needs to be refueled and repaired and stuff. And then it accepts payments in Bitcoin from people who need a lift. And you can imagine